Hello viewers. Today I'm going to discuss how you can secure a web API using token-based authentication. And for this I'm going to use the OIDC provider, which is OpenID Connect provider, as my identity server. And it's going to use the OAuth 2 to get the access token, in which you can use later on to call your web API. And for the client side, I have used a simple client application using which uses the Microsoft authentication library package, or the SDK, to authenticate a user and get the access token. So before starting, let me explain how conceptually the overall process works. So suppose you have an identity server. So what does it mean is you have a database or a server where you have all the user information, and those are the user you want to give access to your application. Now, how you authenticate? The first thing you want to do whenever user comes to log into your application is try to authenticate the user. And the user information is in the identity server or the authentication server. So in this case, for example, I have used OpenID Connect, which is the Microsoft Azure authentication server, or so, and it's the identity server which keeps all the information. So when the user comes to the application, and then as part of the login process, you have to call the Azure OpenID Connect server to authenticate the user. And then once the user gets authenticated, it will return you back an access token. And then token is the proof that, or it's the ID, or to use it to 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 authenticate the future, all the actions that the user is going to take inside your application. For example, once you have the token, then using that token you can call all the APIs that your application calls, and every time your API gets a request and it contains that token, it can validate the token against the OpenID Connect to make sure this is a valid request. So the first step here you want to do here is just set up the Azure site, Azure portal, to create an application. So what I mean by that is, first, say in the Azure I have users, right? So these are all the users. Now what I want is all these users to be, I want to allow all these users to use the my application. Now one of the user is the test user, which I'll be used in our all the examples. So first we create the user in the Azure, and then next is the app registration. So we have to go to the app registration, and then we have to register a new app. So what is a new app is going to do is, this is the app or the client application that we are going to use, or our application is going to use to authenticate the user. So first, when you go to the registration, so I have already created a simple client, which is the employee client. So I have an existing application called employee, which basically stores the information about a list of employees. So I have created a client called employee client. So if you go there, so some of the things that I'm going to show you here that you need to make sure when you create this app, you have them, and you also keep them stored at your site, which will be used later on. So when you register a new app, it gives you an application ID or the client ID. So you need that, and also it will give you a tenant ID as well. The next thing that you want to make sure is that in the authentication, You have to define a redirect URI. So what does it mean is when you call this app to authenticate a user, and once the user is authenticated, it will go back to your application. So what would be the URL that it will go back? So this is where you are going to set up the URL. And I have set it up as a single page application because the front-end app that I have created is a SPA, or a single page application. That's what I've selected here. The next, you need to create a secret, client secret. So when you go add a new secret, it will give you a value. Just give the value. I'm going to show you later on my video where you're gonna use it. The next thing is the API permission. In fact, no, that's the exposing an API. So this is where you define the scope of this. So when we create this app, so what exactly you're trying to access, so that's where you are going to add the scope of it. And I have created one scope where it says who can consent. Both the admin and the users can consent it. And I think that's all you need for the client app. As I mentioned, that you need those client ID and tenant ID later on your process. So in the overview, you'll see that this client ID and tenant ID. So I kept that, and I'll show you where I would be using it. So once that is done, my client is created, or app is created in Azure. Then I go to Visual Studio, and as you can see, these are the projects I have in my employee solution. I have a web API project and the client project. So let's start with the client project. So when a user comes to this my application, this is where it's going to land, home page. So if you go see the main layout, so it has a login display component, which is basically this component. And as I mentioned, I'm going to use the Microsoft authentication library, the MSAL SDK, or the software development kit, to do the user authentication and authorization. So MSAL is a Microsoft authentication library. It's a software development kit to help the developers to do the user authentication and authorization with very fewer number of codes without going in knowing details. And then Microsoft basically automated the things, and you can use it, and it can handle a lot of the things out of the box. For example, it has a component authorize view. You can just use that component. So, and within that, it has two authorized and non-authorized components. So once the user is authorized, it knows automatically, and then it's going to show this portion. If it is not authorized, then it's going to show the login link. But how you are going to configure this, you just need to configure the MSAL in your program.cs of that project to use it. So if I go to the program.cs, first of all, before going there, just I have an app settings created. So in the app settings, I have all the configuration. Remember, I mentioned about having that client ID and tenant ID that I created from the app. So this is where I'm going to store it. So I have a section called Azure AD where I have the authority, where there's the link of the like the OpenID account link, and where I pass the tenant ID. So this is the tenant ID that I mentioned here. That's the tenant ID. And then I have the client ID, which is the client ID, as I mentioned, this one. So, and then I have the API scope, the scope that I defined in that application. So once I have that, and this is my the base URL of my API. So remember, I have this API project as well. So that's the base API URL. Now, as I was showing, now if in the program.cs, in the builder service, now I'm going to add all these services. So first of all, I'm just adding the HTTP client employee API, where I define the base address as the API base URL. So once I register this HTTP client into the service collection, what it's going to do, I don't have to worry about any time I call the HTTP client using this, it's going to call this base URL. So all my API endpoints within this is going to be called, and then the token, that access token that we get back from the user, will be automatically attached in every call. So this is just some of the service provider configuration that we are doing here. And then finally, this is the important part, that as I said, we are using the MSAL library. We are adding that MSAL authentication library into the service collection, and this is where I am adding the configuration. So I'm just going, it's going to the app settings and then getting the section Azure AD, that this whole section, and then included in the configuration. And once you do that and you add that, and then you in the actual Razor page, you can add this component as your view, and this does automatically does a lot of the backend stuff. So once you say you're not logged in, and when you click login, basically it's going to redirect you to the authentication page. And if you see my authentication page, is just a simple one component that I'm using, and it is also a built-in component inside the Microsoft WebAssembly authentication package. So what it does is basically this component, whenever you click that link and it redirects here, because I have this component, it's going to redirect you to the actual identity provider based on the URL you have set up here. So this is the URL, and it is going to redirect you to your provider, and then there you are going to put your username and password, and once you're authenticated, it will call back the, remember the callback URL that we set up, it is going to return you back to that callback URL. If you remember the URL that you set up here, the callback URL, so this is where it is going to send you back with the access token, and then this library handles everything automatically. It is going to extract the token, it is going to cache it, and it is going to be persistent through the app, and also it takes care of renewing it time to time. And you don't have to worry about anything. Every time it's close to expire, if you're still using app, it's going to automatically renew that. So, and then once you get the access token, it is now in the user context, and then when you call the backend API, so this is the client part I am showing you now. In the API side, what you need to do is, because now what's going to happen, as far what I have shown you so far, you come here to your app, you click login, this component is going to redirect you to your identity provider, OpenID Connect, and then you are going to log in there and get authenticated. It is going to call back your application again with the access token and user information. Your application is going to store that, cache it, and then say after that you click, if you see your home page, you have once you authenticate it, see, once you're authorized, then we are showing the view employees. So when you click view employees, it's going to call the employees page, which is here, this one. And in the employees code behind, if you see, all we are doing is during the time of initialization, we are calling the API employees. And when you make that call, as we already registered the our HTTP client with the base URL, it is going to call your base URL and append this route API/employees. So this is going to call your API endpoint, and it is going to include the access token as part of the header as the authorization bearer token. So this is what I've shown you SOPA is going to do. Now, once your API receives that, it also have to validate that, okay, the access token that I got, this is the actual token that I'm going to authenticate, or whoever, this is the valid token who can use the API. So for that, you have to do the similar configuration. Now, if I go to my API project, again, I have an app settings where I have a section called authentication. There I define the authority, because who is authority or issuer of that token. And then audience, this is where they define the scope and the tenant ID. And also I have this program class where I create the So in the program class, if you see, I get this tenant ID, and this is where I'm adding the course because I have our client app trying to access it, our API. So I'm allowing this adding the policy so that it can allow the call the client is going to make. And this is the part where we are adding the authentication. So I'm saying, okay, add the authentication into your service collection, add the JWT bearer token, and this is the authority of who has issued that token, and that's the audience. All these are getting from the settings, and then you just validate the token, and make sure you validate the issuer, validate the audience, validate the lifetime if it is expired or not, and also the issued signing key. And these are the valid issuers that you are going to authenticate. So that's all the configuration that you need, and the app settings. And then finally you go to your actual controller where you have this your employees controller. If you see, this is my API employees controller, and this is the employees. Now when the get employees makes call to this action, and I just made this whole controller, I added the tag authorized. This is what can make sure that any call that is made to this employees controller is authorized. That means it contains the access token, which is valid based on this authority or the configuration that you added to the settings. So now if I run it, and you can see that. So that's my API endpoint running into this port, and this is my client-side app. You see, now when I log into the home page, I'm not authenticated, so I don't see the view employees link. Now if I log in, as I said, now it's going to redirect me to my identity provider, and that's where I have this test user. Try to log in with this test user, and then once authenticated, see, it comes back, it returns back to my application, and now I'm authenticated. It shows my name, and now the view employees link shows up. Now if I click view employees, it is going to make call, and see, I'm getting all the employees back from there. Now you see how we can secure and web API so easily using this token-based authentication. I will put a link to this repository in the comments so that you can download the code and see and view the code and then see how everything is working and run it locally. But if you have any other question, you can always leave a comment. Thanks for watching.